This is Aaron Azrod, and welcome to the 12th episode of the Truth Island podcast. I'm joined here with Alexander, and today we will be exploring the topic of where personal responsibility ends and social responsibility begins. In these frustrating times of high unemployment and rapidly expanding automation, it has never been more important than it is now to discuss what role the state has in providing its citizens and where exactly each man, woman, child hold themselves accountable. Ideas such as UBI or Universal Basic Income have gained traction over the years. But does that mean we have stopped expecting anything from everyone? Or perhaps the things that we are expecting are no longer the things that our society needs and requires. Alexander, why don't you take over and let us know why this is a topic you're interested in?
Well, I think that those are two very sacred responsibilities, both for me as an American and also for the government that I choose to live within. So my personal responsibility, I think that there are a few things that I have to do every day in order to make myself happy and growing. And I think the same way in terms of how the social responsibility, which I guess you could say is like a collective responsibility, maybe not so much an institutional responsibility, but kind of like how our culture upholds certain ideals as the more important thing to keep in line. So for my personal responsibility, really for me, the essence of life for me is growth. And growth to me is a sense of honesty. And traveling through my life with as much honesty and truth as I can, even if it means, taking a very hard look at the things that I've done. I have to be honest with myself and I have to be honest with others. Otherwise, I'm not going to grow. It's when I don't grow that I feel like my personal responsibility isn't being really managed well. So I think first and foremost, honesty and truth is the most essential item for my personal responsibility. You could say the same thing for social responsibility. Truth and honesty. But I would argue that it actually matters a little less, because it comes to a point where you start having these like groupthink that you have to kind of talk to society almost like they're a child that doesn't know better, and you have to be the parent in the room. I don't know where that line is, I don't know where that exact responsible line is, but I think that is part of the equation.
Alex, I kind of want you to expand. I like what you said about growth. Can you talk about what are some of the things that are within your domain of growth? So under Stoicism, for example, you have to bucket the things that are out of your control and the things that are within your control. So in your personal life, what would you say you're accountable for in terms of your own growth?
My word is definitely, if not the most important thing, promises that I make. And Lord knows I've broken so many promises, right? But, it's really about just doing your absolute best to uphold that. For me, it's really like morning time, honestly. It's like where I go to hone those things because it's controllable. I can wake up at a particular time in the day. The world is quiet. The sun's just coming up. Birds are chirping. And I have this small chunk of time where I can work on myself and work on what I think is my sense of honesty and forging, mentally speaking, changes in my life for my growth. So in terms of the absolute core essentials to that, really, for me, it's waking up early in the morning and writing down in my journal, which I've kept doing for a long period of time. And there's been swaths of time where I've not done it, of course.
It's funny you mention this waking up early, because we tend to think of alarm clocks as only being that thing that we use for work. Like, oh my God, I have to be up at 5:30. But it could be a Saturday, and maybe there are things that you want to achieve on a Saturday. And I think personal accountability is still using that alarm clock on a Saturday in order to achieve the things that you want to do, whether it's cleaning your apartment or going for a long bike ride. You always have that power to take ownership of your day, and that's what I like about waking up early.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, me too. Having ownership of your day is kind of like being the captain of your own life ship. It's otherwise you're just, a ship with no sail. You're just floating wherever the current takes you. So waking up and having ownership is a good way for you to direct that.
One thing I also find helpful is I'm still recovering, but I have a huge YouTube addiction. I watch a lot of YouTube, and YouTube would usually lull me in the morning. That time where you wake out of your bed and you just grab your phone, maybe go on a little Facebook, and you see this cool video, and then that video leads to another video. I find that the only way that I can combat my YouTube addiction is if I have something that I have to accomplish at like 10 a.m. If I have something on my calendar that like, okay, at 10 o'clock I'm talking with this person, or I'm taking a walk over here, then that immediately, whether it's a day that I have work or don't have work, it doesn't really matter. If I have something on my calendar, then that kind of gives that day purpose immediately.
Yeah, I think assigning something on a day is a good way of like practicing personal accountability too, right? If you're designating your Saturday to do those things and then you go and you do it, you definitely get like a dopamine hit in your reticular activation zone, and your brain spreading that chemistry throughout your entire body, and you feel completely motivated and, you know, like you did something. Absolutely. I think honestly for me though, it's ironic because I need to add a disclaimer here. You know, for the past few months, like my sense of personal ownership has been in a far more like stasis place, you know, like an introspective, like calm water kind of place, as opposed to activity, you know, and everyone's going through their own specific challenges here through this particular time. But my personal accountability for me has been more like taking stock entirely from like end to end, like real deep dives into what am I doing here? Why am I here? Am I following through with a higher purpose? And maybe that's where for my personal ethos, like where personal accountability starts to then with social responsibility. Because as Americans and as thinkers, which, you know, I would like to assume we're both in agreement, you know, you're definitely a thinker. I would like to think of myself as one.
I'm flattered you think I'm a thinker.
You know, it's like, why am I doing these things? Like, what's the overarching, like, what's the magnum opus of what you do from day to day?
You touched on a chord that I think a lot of people are actually struggling with right now, and that's this idea of introspection or personal growth. So when we put something on our calendar for like 10 a.m., for example, we always think it has to be something external. Like, I have to get on the subway, I have to go here. But what happens when your growth requires you to be in your apartment? Or what if it requires you to cultivate thoughts in your head? And I think that's the difficult part for most people, is growing, but not necessarily taking a trip to the library. I mean, if the libraries were even open right now, but finding a way to grow within our personal space. And the way I kind of think of it is, if you have that thing on Saturday at 10 a.m. that you must do, then even if it is within the confines of your apartment, then it's, I'm reading this book at 10 a.m. Or it's, I am meditating at 10 a.m. Or I am journaling, like you said earlier, at 10 a.m. But the trick is that watching Netflix or engaging in some type of distraction is not a part of that personal growth. It's okay if you don't leave your apartment because your personal growth requires you to be at home, but having like some kind of TV in the background, I think that kind of derails most people.
I agree. And I think people just don't really think of themselves as, you know, there's only so much space that you have in your head in a day, you know, and there should be a little bit of a sanctity in that. And I think that part of philosophy has been sincerely lost. And now we're getting into like the social responsibility. The social responsibility should be instilling those values into you early enough, where you look at yourself as some form of sacred, living, conscious being floating through this crazy rocket ship out in space that has the ability to build skyscrapers. That's pretty damn cool. So it's, of course, like, it's so easy for us with microphones to be like, you know, actualize yourself, become the ultimate version. But like, not even that. Just the sacred stuff, right? Like, where are your boundaries when you are protecting yourself? Like, what is your level of vulnerability? It's not a binary yes or no. Well, I can be vulnerable to a point, but yes, at a point there has to be a boundary where it's like, oh no, that's okay. I'm not comfortable with that. This is where I draw the line, like, respectfully. But no one's teaching that. And so I think all those distractions, the like the YouTube, which, God, Lord knows, I'm such a history YouTube nerd. So I dive down deep in that. Hours and hours of lectures and shit, stupid, you know, silly stuff.
I wouldn't say that's the biggest waste of time. But okay.
You know,
I've
we'll
watched
see.
a lot worse things on YouTube.
Fair enough. But, you know, people don't view their mental garden as I like to call that, in that capacity where it's like there's an inner peace into having space in between things, right? Where it's, it doesn't have to be so overgrown. And one essence of life to me is like everything is always shifted out and decaying and growing at the same time, So it's like the opportunity to choose those things that go into your head is one of the most sentient things you can do in your life, especially today. Like right now, I think we're in this kind of evolutionary period where it's just we have, all this data coming through, right? And like we're getting up to 5G and the Internet of Things is coming through, and interaction with how those things start operating is going to change. Information's even going to double, triple, Moore's law. We can get into all that, but you do have the opportunity to choose that. The difficult part is that everything we enjoy that gives us additional like opportunities to learn things, i.e. YouTube, right? You can learn anything on YouTube.
Yeah, you could. It could be a force of good.
I agree. And it is, but there's always a duality to that, right? And so, the personal responsibility should be, I'm choosing what I'm letting into my mental garden. And the social responsibility should be, we're cautious about what we have socially available to be consumed without any kind of gatekeeping.
I like that. I like this idea of a mental garden because as a gardener, you have to take responsibility for plucking the weeds. And if you have, let's say something like YouTube, for example, maybe there is a philosophical YouTube video, or you're listening to like a Noam Chomsky speech, or something that's really profound and really is going to help enhance your thinking, then that's an example of something that should be allowed in the garden from time to time. Yes. But you, as the gardener, have to be like, no, that was a silly kind of YouTube. We used to call it YouTube poop video, like just a ridiculous kind of absurd video that you would just watch to waste time. You, as the gardener, have to be like, no, that's a weed, and I need to take that out of my garden.
Mm-hmm. And, information really is power, right? I mean, just all changes in history stem from new particular pieces of information that, were either intentionally distorted or discovered, and like that's like a 12-hour conversation, right? So if we already know, just resembling through history, that information is all of those things, information has that power to change, then that should be taught at a very young age, right? Not attaching moral to it, but like a neutral ground, right? Like where's the intermezzo between all the crazy stuff that we go through, right? Like it doesn't need to be religious, but that's one way. It doesn't need to be necessarily like ideological. It just should be this kind of like purgatory where it's like it is and it isn't at the same time. The values equal the same. This is just how your physiology soaks in information, and whatever you feel towards that, your emotional connections to that, is like your roadmap through that, I think.
I think that's kind of why people, when they have their Saturday, it kind of turns into a YouTube/Netflix Saturday in terms of their personal growth. It's because they want to see human faces on the TV and feel emotion. Like, I don't know if people necessarily watch something on Netflix because they want to learn. I mean, there are people out there who do watch documentaries about the stock market and so forth, but a lot of people want to see a drama. They want to see a woman crying and running down the streets. They want to see an angry man. They want to feel these emotions, and I think that it's okay to feel emotions, but let those emotions be internal to yourself. Like, you're joyful because you've achieved something, or you're upset at a loved one. Don't necessarily live vicariously through the mediums that you're engaging with.
Yeah, and I think that is the natural monkey brain pull to these things. Like, I was just commenting to a friend today about how Instagram just turned into this like sexual thing, and now these reels, and it's just totally altering my experience with that content. And I think in terms of the way modern society views content is that they're not really looking at it in spectrum. Yeah. It's like, did I get it or did I not? But the reality is like, it's so easy to just pull up YouTube and to find those things that it detracts from the value of more consistent. It's like tortoise and the hare. Like we're always trying to reach the hare, but it's better to actually think, oh, okay, well, if I were to learn a skill, right? Like if I were to learn how to barbecue, And I know that, my two best friends, they live together in this apartment. They know how to barbecue. If I learn how to barbecue, I will have that connection with them over barbecue in a more sustainable, like richer way that's actually tangible, that applies meaning. I think people just look at YouTube and content kind of as like, I need this now. And I honestly think that I can explain the physiological reactions to that and how people can fix it, because I've recently studied this and like mapped out my whole thought process and like where does my heroic fantasy stem from? Like at what particular part of my thought does that like branch off, and like what part of my brain takes care of that, and how does that go? And it's dangerous. It's a sliding scale.
I love exactly what you're saying, because I think that what we're doing is we're opting for the cheap kind of journeys. Like, we're all watching Luke Skywalker, and we make that our journey. Oh, Luke Skywalker's journey is my journey. But we're denying ourselves real human interaction and real journeys. And I think that the emotional intensity you have in doing a barbecue with some friends and actually achieving something and producing great food, and you talk to 10 people in your backyard and saw some fireworks, I think that kind of real life emotional bonding, like watching real fireworks, is really going to make you happier than watching the Death Star explode for the 20th time.
Completely agree. And like what we're talking about is culture.
Yeah.
Like what is our culture? Our culture is like sit in our ivory tower, things are too hot to touch. I can't really involve in like a spectrum of dialogue without feeling some sort of like aggressiveness.
Right.
There's a fragility in that. And every single person alive, I don't care how much you feel about that argument or not, has that sense of fragility. There's posturing on all sides. Like, let's just be 100% clear.
Right.
Humanity isn't that different, yet we're all so different, right? But this is our current culture. Whereas you look at Luke Skywalker, right? What is that about? The hero's journey. Where did the hero's journey start? The Odyssey. Who based their lives off of Homer? Like, who based their lives off of Achilles? Hundreds of famous historic people decided they wanted to live like Achilles.
Yes.
Not, I want to watch Achilles.
Exactly. It's not enough to just consume these myths. Like I'm not saying that these myths are, I'm actually, for those who can't see us, I'm actually wearing a Star Wars shirt right now. But I will say that it's not enough to just consume these myths. We actually have to enact them in some way. And I think that's that's the step that a lot of people have struggled with, is that they consume, they feel good, but then if they're not actually doing something with these myths, it's not leading to any change and not any real emotional change within them.
100%. And this is why, I put so much focus on some of the more classic literature, because it's really about that. It's like, how do I reconnect with my individual self for me to carry through this sense of ethos? And how can I advance my culture in my small little world and the few people that I feel privileged to be around during that time? Like, no one talks about that. No one talks about ethics.
Yeah.
I can't even define to you what our current ethics are. And I think that it'd be easy for us to go into the negative. But like, in terms of just positive, like what are they? And are they upheld? We can say that maybe one of the ethics to being an American is freedom of speech.
Sure.
But that's not entirely true, right?
I mean, it's gotten a lot more difficult, I would say. I would say that there is... I do want to get back to personal responsibility, but just to touch on that briefly, we have this idea that the people who we're talking to are not coming from a good place. And I think that in order to have freedom of speech, there has to be a fundamental belief that the person you're talking to is expressing viewpoints because they want to better humanity. And they might be wrong.
Right.
You might disagree with them, but you see that they are your neighbor. They see that they are your brethren. They just happen to be off course, and you still love them, and they still love you, and everything is good between you. You just disagree about like the graduated income tax.
Right.
And it's not like this emotional, like you're a bad person because you believe you have a slightly different quasi-variant opinion about how taxes should be levied.
get back on the personal responsibility thing.
For sure.
For me, I really think it just comes down to, are you able to understand others, and other opinion? I don't know, I guess if I had to break down my personal sense of code, it's tell the truth, keep yourself accountable, and always remind yourself if there's one thing for sure, it's that you don't know anything at all.
I like this idea. I think that this is something I should probably do, is actually write down my personal code. Because I think we all have personal codes, we're just unaware of them. Like, I like to, like you were saying, when I cannot fulfill a promise, I'm not perfect. There are promises I probably have not fulfilled, but I need to at the very least apologize for it and take ownership over it. Whereas there's other people who may have a different code where it's like, oh, well, I kind of just use people when it's convenient. And I don't know, have you ever been stood up before?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is, I think, the worst form of moral code. Like it's like, okay, I'm not putting that person as a murderer. Like, they're not on the same category.
Right.
But it's at a point where if we agree to meet at a place at 4:00, and this has happened to me before, and you're not there, and there's not even that 20 minutes, oh, hey, so sorry, can't, nothing. I'm just standing there, I text you, I give you a call, and you're not there. That's personal accountability in a nutshell right there. There's nothing systemic about you not making that appointment. And people will be like, oh, I've got 3 kids, you don't understand, we're coming from different places. Fair enough. But pick up your phone an hour before and be like, hey, my kid just got sick, I'm not going to be able to meet you. Even if I was 25% on the way there, I'd be angry. I'm not going to lie. I'm human. I'm going to be upset. But I'm like, thank you for at least picking up the phone and texting me an hour before that you were not going to make it, so I can just get off the train and head on back. But to stand there and not hear anything from you, I think is ridiculous.
Completely agree. And also that they know they're not making it, and then they choose to avoid the facing of the, oh, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Is another degree,
Yes.
It's like another degree of, I don't know what you would call it, shittiness, I guess, shit squared.
Shit squared. I love that. It's just this inability of not having a personal moral code that comes down to, because you kind of, if you're one of these people that stands people up, you see every interaction as a transactional relationship. So I'm going to meet this person. What can I get out of them? Oh, that person is of no value to me. Therefore, I don't owe them an explanation. I can just vanish into the wind, and you're not even aware of someone else has a mental state. You're only aware of your own mental state and what's directly in front of you, and anyone else is suffering, you're completely oblivious to.
100%. And that may be the worst of all sins, honestly, is to what's that term when you're in your own box? You're in your own echo chamber?
Yes.
It's I was like that. I was like that coming out of college, honestly.
We've all had periods of that, sure.
And when I came to the city and I was helping run this acting studio, it was really everything that we're saying we're missing, they had in spades, right? These random people coming up, really diving into their personal stories, because the art form of the acting we were doing was kind of like putting real life into these, filling the words up with our real life is the simplest way of putting it. So there was a lot of off the cuff, expressions of what was actually happening that wasn't on camera or anything, that we used as kind of like a vehicle.
Right.
And that was the art form, and that's messy in its own right. We could talk about that. But what was amazing for me as an audience member was seeing all these people come up and just talk about their experiences, and so my perception started to honeycomb, and I realized that it's not simple cell, it's complex, right? It's
right.
There's all these different degrees, and where I thought I was being empathetic and open to other people's plights and internal whateverness, I wasn't enough, and it was, moments like that where I started hearing the stories and started to really understand that the most generous thing you can do in a day is listen.
Yes.
Full stop.
Absolutely. I think that should also be a part of people's moral code is, okay, I've done my fair share of talking, and that's needed. We all have things we have to get off our chest, and that's fine. But there's an ebb and flow, and there's a give and take in all of this. And I always, I come to this quote. I think I heard it on the show Mad Men, where Don Draper is saying, "Oh, it's not polite to talk about yourself." And for some reason, that quote has always just stood with me. And we can debate, I don't think it's like, if you have some really good news in your life and you share it, I don't think you're rude. But I like this idea that there's a little check in your mind of like, it's not all about me. Like, it's like, I don't just meet people to just talk about myself. I meet them because I also care about what's going on with them as well.
Talking about our sense of code, that exact subject to me has evolved in the past 3 weeks, 4 weeks.
Nice.
I'm pretty private outside my inner circle. My inner circle, I probably lean more towards oversharing. And, that I don't think really is an effective way. And where I think that, especially as men, there's not really a safe space in terms of talking like that so much.
Yeah.
And I was only born a man, so I can't speak for the other sides. But for my personal experience, changing that perception around others can be a little bit dangerous in a lot of ways. Like, you start seeing kind of the groupthink morph into this, and I don't even think it's on purpose. I just think it's subconscious, where it's like they want to treat you like wounded.
Right.
Whereas like someone like myself, I'm extremely open with those that I know are in my inner circle, and I have zero problem talking about anything.
Yes.
To the T, to a point where they're like, some people don't know how to respond because it's exactly how I feel, like good and bad, three-dimensional.
I want to talk about the wounded because I actually think it fits very nicely with our conversation about personal accountability. When I have a problem, I think one solution that I have, and I do confide in friends and so forth, and we have like long walks over cups of tea and Starbucks and so forth.
That's awesome.
One of the things that I do with my friends, though, is that if I have an issue, I always frame it as a problem that I am trying to solve. So whatever the issue is, with personal, at work, it's never like, oh my God, my life is falling to crap, and I'm not saying it in a way of pity me, feel sorry for me, give me a hug. I'm saying it in a way of like, hey dude, I just want to pick your mind on this. So I'm having some difficulty with my boss right now and blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. And when I frame it like that, I don't get the wounded hug. I get more of the like, oh, this is a math problem, or oh, this is a problem that we can solve on this walk. So I think that's kind of a way of being vulnerable if you frame your vulnerability in the form of a question that you're trying to resolve. Does that make sense?
100%. And, I'm not necessarily talking about, that version. What I mean is like if it's over time, like if it's a thing that takes a long time to solve.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a threshold of patience, and like I wonder if some psychologist of some kind can actually put a number to it. Like, how many times could you bring up the subject to somebody before they get tired of hearing you say
yes,
it?
That is.
Is it 4? Is it 7?
That's a very good question. I mean, thankfully we do have like licensed therapists and psychologists that their job is to listen to the same problems.
But are they that great though?
I mean, there are some gems out there. I will say, if you can find there are talented people. I think though that you also have to hold yourself accountable as well in that instance. So if you're talking about the same problem for like 20 different times, you're basically regurgitating the same issue, then that's a point where it's like, okay, I've told enough people about this. I've certainly said it enough times. Now I need to close the door, meditate, journal, and I need to start doing some of that hard work and solving the issue myself. So I think maybe even having a rule like, okay, if I've told at least 8 people about this problem, or I've said this problem at least 10 different times, that's it. Now I need to lock myself in the back cave and figure out how to solve it on my own.
100%. And you should be doing that from the beginning.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's not like...
But it's okay. I will say, look, sometimes it's okay to bounce things off people. If you immediately go into the back cave and say, I got it, you want to kind of just hear your thoughts. Like, it's nice to sometimes just hear how other people react. And you can even just look at their facial, like, you're going to be doing that. And that's okay. You can discard that. You might go with that feeling, but it might be nice to bounce it. But once that bouncing period is over, then there's no excuse. Then you got to do the hard work.
100%. The work always has to be there, but you could be failing the entire time,
Yeah,
but failing forward. But, I just find that interesting because part of our culture is that too, right? It's like to keep things in reserve, like quietly pack away things.
Right, yes.
And that's been evolving, I think. I think it's become a little bit more open.
Yes.
Over maybe the 8-10 years, right? But my parents, at least, like they're pretty tight with that. Like they don't like to talk too much about their personal stuff at all.
Yeah, especially my grandparents. I was having a conversation on another podcast. The World War II generation, man,
totally different.
Those people didn't, and like if they killed somebody in war or saw some other atrocity, you would never even know about it. They
right.
don't even speak of that. And I think that's the other extreme. I think when you're not sharing anything and keeping it totally bottled up, and it's funny because the people that have like the most severe forms of trauma, they're the ones that sometimes keep it quiet.
Right.
And then it's that person who's like, oh my God, I don't know where to take my dog. She ran around the park, and then like that's the person that's like spilling their drama left and right.
Yes, 100%. Right. Squeaky wheel.
Yeah, right. Okay, so thinking back about personal responsibility, I like this idea that there has to be a huge level of, like, we've got the moral code, and we have high levels of introspection and actually solving problems on your own. Would you agree that that's like on the track of like self-improvement of where you need to be?
Yeah, I think you need foundations. How do you build a house? Build the foundation first, right? Like what keeps the tree up?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like it's just simple. It's not ornate.
And then throwing in the idea of a schedule. Like all of this kind of has to be. Now, I know people who carry marble notebooks or put like 1,000 Google Calendar invites in their phone, but there has to be some kind of rough idea of how your days are going to look. And I think that's also a part of personal responsibility. I think if some random friend just texts you and says, hey, let's hang out, maybe it's not always such a good idea that you're always 100% available. Maybe you need to have some target. And one thing I would recommend on the road to personal accountability is if you don't want to fill up every hour with something, at the very least have one thing in the day. And I would say smack dab in the middle of the day is pretty darn awesome. So you don't even have to wake up all that much early. You just have that thing at 12. And then from there, your days might start filling up.
Yeah, I would say plan it weekly, because that just fits nicely.
Yes, I like that.
Of course, everyone's like daily goal. Yes, 100%. But thinking on a weekly like replenishment is good. But I would actually argue doing the opposite. I would actually maybe sometimes even argue don't have a schedule.
Really?
Yeah, I think it depends. What I think people need to look at their lives is like, what are the most important things in my life? What are the most common things in my life? How often am I scheduling? Am I the busy bee that's running around all over the place? Do the opposite. Whatever you do the most of, do the opposite. Because I think the duality in all things is incredibly important. To understand the power of the voice, you go into a period of silence, right? To understand the power of voice, you maybe go into public speaking. Why? They're both talking about the power of voice, that understanding that everything has its own shadow. So I think sometimes like not scheduling is good. Honestly, sometimes I had a pretty substantial breakdown a few years ago, and I didn't know what to do, and I was still living here at the time, and I just said, you know what, I'm just gonna go and travel. Like I'm not gonna have a plan. Like I'm just gonna go. So I got a motorcycle license, and a week later,
nice.
I was traveling cross country 30 days, living out of a backpack, just going wherever I felt. And let me tell you, I didn't have a schedule. And the sense of freedom of that, it's like a type of elation I can't express. I didn't schedule what day I'm landing on what, right? I just said enjoy it as it comes. And that gave me what I needed then. So I think it depends.
There might be, I agree that there might be a period in our life where we do need like cross-country 30-day motorcycle journey. Okay, I think I'm going to go do that now. Bye, guys. But I think that is something. But even that is your schedule is finding yourself on that motorcycle. So I think that it's the purpose. You can remove things from your schedule that you no longer find purposeful. So, for example, if you're going to happy hour 3 days a week or something, you have to sit down and look at your schedule and say, does that have purpose for me anymore? Is it really purposeful to chat and bitch and complain with my coworkers over things I can't control, right? And that's the purpose. And if your schedule involves that motorcycle journey, but you know that after that 30-day motorcycle journey, you're going to have a better perspective of the world and find yourself, then I would say you've scheduled like a life-altering experience. You've actually scheduled 30 days. And also, if you think about it, for that motorcycle journey, there was a lot of preparation that went in there, man. Because you had to get your license, you had to have enough money, like, in advance to make sure that you could buy food and whatnot. Like, so, like, there was, like, some level of foresight in making that journey work.
That's fair. That's definitely fair. I guess, yeah. So, I guess schedule isn't just, like, thinking calendar or timing.
Yeah.
It's, like, also destination. It's, like, arrival.
Yes,
which
I like that.
is such a core part of our human structure, right?
Yes.
Like, think about just where we came from. Finding a foreign shore, or, you know, exploring new lands around your current cave system where you could feel like you could plant, or finding new herds of animals for you to go hunt for your family. All that you could put into calendars, you can put into destination. Like, I see what you mean by that. Maybe, you know, I should look at the motorcycle trip more as that, honestly. But, you know, I didn't really plan it.
Yeah, no,
to be fair.
I totally. I'm sure that it was like it was very impromptu. But what I like about it is that there was a mental destination that you had. Like, I feel
That's
like
true.
sometimes we do things and there's no mental destination. So I think like those happy hour things are like, I just want to kill time. Like, if your idea behind something is like this TV program or this happy hour is going to make the time go by faster, that's killing time. A motorcycle journey, though, that you hope to like learn about the United States or learn and meet interesting folk and see how other people in Kansas live. I would say that has like mental quality to it. Like, you actually have mental quality in doing that because you're trying to get something out of it.
That's fair, you know, and I will definitely like look at that, think about that today too.
Now that we've covered personal responsibility, let's talk more about what's going on in the world right now. So we're both here in New York. We're promised that indoor dining is going to come back in 2 weeks, but we were promised that before, and it actually didn't happen. So who knows if that's actually going to happen. Millions of Americans are unemployed, businesses are shut down, and we have this idea of like, okay, I've got my schedule, I'm doing my push-ups, I have something planned at 10 a.m. every day, I'm waking up early. Where does society kind of come in and owe us something? And then some people say, oh my God, Aaron, you can't say that society owes you anything. Society owes you nothing. Is that really true? Like what are you thinking?
I think society owes someone a lot, but I don't necessarily think that where that boundary ends is where I would agree other people are saying it does. I think that society really owes basic needs, like the most basic step stool, and then have that ironclad. Everyone has a thing that they've come across in their life that never breaks, never falls apart. You could throw it in the mud, it still works, right? Like, that sense of quality, it's so simple.
Yeah.
You know, it's the simplest things. I think society needs to be that. They need to be our simple tools. And then whatever branches off of that, you know, is the flower to our stem. Society needs to be the stem. Where would that end? Well, I'm definitely one to have good health care for everyone.
I agree, yeah.
I think that absolutely needs to come. And people attach certain words to that, socialist, whatever. To be honest, like, my political leanings are so down the middle, it aggravates everyone I talk to.
Same here. You're on the right podcast. You know, the healthcare thing, I never understood that one, because let's just say that you're a really hardcore conservative and you're like, everyone ought to pull themselves up. Well, how does a sick person do that?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I've always said that, like, yes, pull yourself up, but if you're sick, you've kind of made that impossible for that person. And I think it kind of it snowballs into huger problems, because that person's sick, and now they can't go to work, and now they can't pay their rent anymore, and they can't pay a host of other bills. And then if they had just gotten the health care that they need, they would have been able to do all of these things, but because they're unable to get the health care that they need, they then need to utilize more long-term welfare. Whereas if they had just gotten that doctor's appointment and went back to work a week later, everything would have been fine. But now, because I was sick for all that time, I'm homeless, and now I need to be in a shelter, and now I'm kind of on more long-term types of welfare.
I agree. It's really a matter of control, I guess, I mean, with everything in life, people should definitely, who are sick, should be able to just pick up their phone and get help.
Sure.
Like, for any advanced society. And if we're talking about the richest country of all time, right, then, that should be a no-brainer, in my opinion. Welfare, I think, is a different story, honestly. I think that consistent welfare is a problem and a challenge, but there's a million ways to skin a cat. That was a saying that, like, we would say in Georgia, right? There's a million ways to skin a cat. So there's a million ways to give welfare. What if you were to find out that the person on welfare spends 70% of their welfare check on food? Is it more effective for you to choose healthy food and package it to them as opposed to giving them a monetary credit?
EBT card, yeah.
Well, EBT, you still buy bad food.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like, they're not, because a lot of people aren't educated on what is good food. So here's what I would suggest society should do. Like, I learned about this on this trip that I took, right? It's called the trophic cascade. I've never heard of this thing before.
Never heard of it either.
So it's something in natural science, right? So I think it was 20 years ago, the beef industry pushed out wolves in America because they were killing the cattle, and that's one of our top exports. So they got rid of the gray wolf. Recently, we've been reintroducing it, and this is basically what's happened. The gray wolf comes in, and all the game doesn't realize that they're being hunted anymore because they've had 2-3 generations of no wolves. So they feel very safe. They're hanging out in the riverbanks. Their heads are down, drinking water. They're not paying attention. So what changes from that? Because of the effect of one specific entity, there's this amazing bounty of change. So now this game is no longer on the riverbanks of rivers. So what happens? The reeds start growing back, which means fish eggs have a place to go, which means fur is now raising, which means beavers coming, which means they can create more wetland, which means more fowl, more fir trees, so on and so forth. So a single entity, when looked at, can create a trophic cascade.
Wow.
That is how I think society should operate. Where are our vector points of creating a trophic cascade? And then only do that. Because the choice should be for personal responsibility. Well, I want that or I don't. Social responsibility should be, we're here to make sure that you can elevate yourself as a human. There's no other agenda other than that.
Yeah. Forgive me, my physics knowledge on vectors is a little weak, but I will say this, with the vector point with, let's say food stamps, for example. If, let's say, the government said, okay, with this card you can only buy healthy food, but let's just pretend that did happen. Now, there would be some people that would march to the streets and be like,
yes,
well, that's my civil liberties. But
and
I
right.
kind of see it a little differently. I would say, okay, you, for whatever reason, maybe it's your fault, maybe through no fault of your own, you're unable to feed yourself. I remember I talked to somebody who was from Thailand, and she said that in Thailand there are these Buddhist monks, and every morning the Buddhist monks will come down from the monastery and they have their hands open, or they have an empty bowl that they carry with them, and the only way that they can eat is based on whatever someone gives them. They cannot pick their own food. They cannot be like, no, I want that corn over there. So they walk around town and they just have their empty bowl, and whatever they are given, no matter how old that piece of bread is, no matter how stale something is, they have to say thank you, and that's how they live. And the funny thing about these Buddhist monks is that they never starve to death. They've never gotten to a point where no one has no food and they are just turned away and they die. They're always given something, but they kind of have this humility that okay, my food supply is completely dependent on somebody else. Therefore, I should have no say in what it is that they give me. So if I'm not, if I'm not producing my own food, then I have to be kind of reliant on whatever other people say that I should eat, whether I like it or don't like it. And I see the same thing with the food stamps. It's like, okay, maybe this is your fault, maybe it's not your fault. But the bottom line is that if somebody else is putting food in your mouth, do you really have the right to kind of criticize what food is coming towards you?
Yeah, and it's an opportunity to leverage. And leverage sounds like, like power over somebody. So let me reframe that. It's an opportunity to apply, I don't know, leverage is the only word that I can come to, right? It's a chance for a government who's spending money to feed somebody who's in need and also maybe educate them on the purpose of food.
Yes.
Which is to replenish yourself.
Right.
And to give you more willpower. And, to have that as a new leapfrog point so that things aren't so hard.
Right.
But they don't approach it that way.
No, they don't.
It's either like you have to eat this government cheese, which, by the way, half of it's plastic, right? Grilled cheeses, basically. That's like what American cheese is. I argue that there's a better way. There's a different way.
Sure.
And I think that's kind of where like corporate entities have a more service-minded approach, honestly, than some government.
Yes.
And that's why a lot of people like really want corporate people to come into government, which, I don't necessarily agree with. But the idea of like, no, I'm going to improve whatever I can, and this is why it's useful to stick with me,
right,
should be the basis of government. But, I think that message is lost. So that kind of trophic cascade, whether it be healthcare, food, transportation, all those things, and there's always a cost. That should be the conversation. I'm not saying like wave a magic wand and make that done, because there's always like, well, how many cameras are on transit systems and,
Yes. So I like this idea that, like it kind of comes down to the phrase like beggars can't be choosers in this sort of way. So that when social like we agree that there is social responsibility in terms of healthcare, in terms of food, and would you even go as far as to add that to like housing? Should everyone have a roof over their head, or is that going too far?
I think the ideology behind my choice on that would be everyone should have a roof over their head.
Okay.
But that gets muddled up with a whole bunch of other factors. But I would also argue that the way we're building isn't even the right way. I think the way we build everything is extremely plastic and flimsy. I divulge my thinking into how the ancients did it and how they still have structures today that are completely operational to a point.
Right. The Olmecs still have their heads out there.
Exactly. Perfect example, right? The Olmecs, 100%. One of the oldest stone structures we have, right? Still up there and available. So, I would say, how much focus is the government putting on a state of permanence as opposed to how can we cycle it through?
I want to share a story, and this is actually a story my uncle told me about someone he knew that moved into a housing project in the 50s. And this guy that he knew moved into a brand new housing project that had just been erected in the Bronx in the 1950s. And it was really clean. It was actually pretty decent looking. Now we could say maybe they used like cheap drywall or this and that. But it was a really clean housing project. Within 2 years, the entire housing project facility was completely trashed. People were not throwing out their garbage, or they would just open up their windows and literally just toss the trash out the window. They couldn't be bothered.
I hate that.
Yeah, they couldn't be bothered to take the trash to the garbage disposal. And again, people look at housing projects and think, well, that was cheaply built. That's why these housing projects are failing, like the drywall. And maybe there's some truth in that. Maybe the architects and the engineers who made these things did cut corners. I totally believe that that's true. But I do say to him, like the fact that he moved into this facility when it was brand new and the walls were completely white and clean and everything, and then within 2 years the entire place was trashed, I think regardless of how flimsy the structure is, the inhabitants have a responsibility to take good care of that structure.
100%. But I think that there's a balance there. And I think that correlation isn't exactly causation with that. There's so many factors to that, right? So for a housing project, a lot of the trash is like fast food stuff, right?
Yeah, right.
It really is. A lot of fast food products, a lot of plastic bags, a lot of,
Cigarettes.
And so I think because you're the product of the 5 people you hang out with the most, and you're in this horribly depressing location, and you don't have an option to change it for yourself, and everyone's feeling this way, I think we have more of a social responsibility to create an environment that doesn't necessarily perpetuate that. And look, this is all well and good, right, in the thought. I'm not saying I have this drawn out in a plan, right? But
right.
there's a better way to house a human being than putting them into a tall building surrounded by potential crime that, cuts corners in every advantage to living possible. There's no life behind it.
Let me ask you this. If we, let's say, erected new housing projects and they were made out of like state-of-the-art material, like we got like marble, we got chandeliers, top notch, and the people who initially move into that project will be enamored by it, right? So if we were to start all over again and create like really pristine, gorgeous looking housing, how does the government then enforce personal accountability and be like, hey, don't eat so much fast food, and when you eat, and when you do eat, please use this garbage disposal? Like how does the government do that without being labeled the evil fascist police?
100%. And that's always the thing, right? Being labeled the evil fascist police. Well, I would say this. There's really 2 ways you can do it. You can do it like on a monetary way, right? It's like, what's the cost in a 5-8 year period of revamping an entire housing project due to destruction of property, trash, and the removal of particular things. Okay, great. So we got a number, right? Now, if we were able to incentivize, I'm not saying directly pay, I'm saying incentivize, with a beacon of hope, whether it's a credit on your education or a specific grant that can be sent to your college degree, or covers funeral costs, or maybe it employs an elderly person to be going around the community to make sure everyone's safe and healthy. Something like that. If you were to find the cost and then identify a way where you can incentivize the culture of responsibility with things that matter, that help people grow, then I think that would be a great way. But I don't necessarily think it's working like that. And there's a lot that I don't know on the subject matter, right?
No, for sure. I think in a lot of these communities, tapping into like the elderly population that kind of lives there is a good, because they sometimes come to a place of wisdom, and they kind of come to a place of like, okay, I see like gangs, I see things around this neighborhood that I'm not really feeling. I think if they were better utilized as being beacons of the community,
right,
and sort of had relationships with public officials or the police or whoever it is that's responsible for like patrolling and upkeeping that area, then you've kind of given power and you've given like autonomy to a person that actually lives within that unit. Because we always see it as like the fascist state as being something external, like people who live in wonderful mansions that then come to the housing project and boss people around. But I think that if there were positions of leadership and those people actually lived in those projects, then people would actually listen, because they're actually in the same boat.
Yeah. I think that there's always a solution to almost any problem. Like if I was in their position, this is what I'd be thinking. Well, the whole world is trying to keep me here. The cards are stacked against me. In my opinion, it feels very structural, right? And quite frankly, those around me all aren't necessarily giving me the example I need to rise above those expectations. So if you were to identify those 3 trophic cascades and then find a way to address those within the community itself, their accountability is going to be the end result. They're not able to point to other factors. Or this particular hallway is filthy because of that government entity, or sometimes giving the person the responsibility to take care of it themselves while also having this really great reward, which can be earned, not given, is a really great way for that habitual cycle to change.
I want to relay a story. I want to see how you would react to this, okay? So there was an elderly man that actually lived in my building, and he doesn't do this anymore. But when we went to the trash disposal, sometimes people throw the wrong thing in there, they throw the wrong box in there, or they mismatch, or they just don't properly dispose of it. They just throw it in the room and then don't throw it down the chute. This elderly man would actually, like, if it had some kind of label or he had an idea of where it came from, he would actually take that trash and put it in front of someone's door. Do you think that that's going too far? Is that too passive aggressive? Is that too rude? Or is that just like the right level of like, hey, you didn't dispose of this trash properly, I'm sending it back to you?
Honestly, I would say it depends on just how crappy of a person that, person who's messing with everyone's trash is. I don't think that that's necessarily the worst case scenario that, a crazy old man can do in retaliation of some poor tenancy, right?
Right.
But obviously that raises the question, well, is he even coherent enough to realize that it's, that he's doing this on purpose, or is he just bringing it out to the person's door?
I think his intention, I spoke to this guy, and he got in trouble for doing that.
Of course.
And he said, don't, it's not up to you. We'll take care of it. And his rationale was like, if I bring the trash to their door, it's just a sign that I'm aware, or somebody's aware, that you're not properly disposing of your trash. You're not recycling it properly. Please do this again. That was, now, whether the person on the other end of that door interpreted that way, probably not. They probably were like, oh my God, that's Seymour, blah, that's not his name, but that's him just being crazy. And I don't know, it could also be a moment where that person on the other end of the door says, all right, I'll make sure that this milk carton goes in the blue trash bin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. It could 100% work, It depends on what kind of person that is, the tenant we're talking about, who isn't necessarily doing things properly. I mean, sometimes the check is what you need.
Yes.
People are afraid to say that, but sometimes you need a gut check.
One thing also that interests me is that I feel like this idea of personal accountability is much higher amongst the much older in our society. You hear of these, have you ever been to the Tenement Museum in Lower East Side?
I've not.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do check it out. It's awesome. And these people absolutely lived in squalor. It was very rough going.
This is like Gangs of New York times, or?
Yeah. This is late 19th century, early 20th century. So you have a lot of Eastern Europeans, a lot of Jewish, Irish immigrants that are coming into the city at this time. And believe me, you would hear these stories of 3 families crammed into one room and so forth. Yeah. But there seemed to be a sense of community. There seemed to be this idea of you knew who all your neighbors were. You may not like them, and they may snore really loudly at night, but there was this sense of community, so that if you did something really, really, really bad, everyone, living in that tenement building would hear about it and can kind of hold you accountable.
Right. But I think that isn't necessarily a failure on how we set up housing as much as it is a failure on how we reinforce culture.
Right, yes.
People from those times are coming from a place where it's all oral tradition. They're very close with the generation before them. They're in a tighter age range from their parents and their grandparents. They can have great-grandparents. Very few people these days have great-grandparents alive.
Yeah.
Right?
True.
That they kind of go by 10, 12, if you're lucky.
Yeah.
Because
people are having kids older.
I
think people had kids younger back then, so there was more of a chance for great-grandparents.
Yes, and the reason why I bring that up is because I think that there's a stronger congruency in the links of the chain, right?
Yeah.
And that, coupled with the fact that their whole culture wasn't around internet and the exploitation of those things, and also the gold rush of the one paragon entity that resembles that cultural signifier. I love The Rock, but he is the signifier of Hollywood man, right?
Yeah. Right.
He is, and there's signifiers in so many different places. So we flock to that. And you could say those are heroes, but it's not the same because it's daily. I think that because we have that, we've lost that sense of community.
Yes.
So we definitely need that 100%.
To summarize what we're saying here is that we all believe in social responsibility, and we believe in healthcare, food stamps, and even housing. But I think that with each of these things, there's a touch of here's your responsibility in it. And even with the healthcare example, we provide that free healthcare under the assumption that, okay, you're going to sit in the hospital for a month and get better, and then once you get better, you're going to reintegrate into society and be productive once again. And I think that with everything that we offer, there's always this layer of like, here, we're not just giving it to you, we're giving it to you, but it comes at you personally growing in some way.
Yeah. And also, we're not really willing to lay ourselves down on the altar for what's next. Like, can you imagine if the U.S. government was like, okay, here's what we need to do to get everyone in this country free healthcare, perfect healthcare. If you have cancer, it's like, what? You just roll into a hospital, say, I need to get better. If you break a leg, you roll into the hospital, you say, get better. But the trick is that the current living generation can't get it.
Right, exactly.
But they'll pay for it.
Yeah.
We'll take $5 out of your check. But every other generation in America will have it forever.
Exactly, right.
Do you think we'd be willing to do that?
I certainly would. Like, I
believe that.
I think that just living that like over my head, like anytime I lose a job or something like that, it's kind of nice to just say to myself, oh, that's not an issue. And also, I think the Democrats made a good argument that it would actually promote a lot more entrepreneurs, would actually promote people working part-time, because we're really chained to our full-time jobs, and there's nothing worse in killing innovation than a full-time job. It's awesome for health benefits and paying your rent on time, but if you're working full-time, it can be very, very difficult to like kind of start that idea, because you come home late from work, you're like, all right, yeah, I'm gonna now start building the website and doing this.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's a lot of people, depending on where you are at life, that could get by. Maybe they have enough savings and they could get by working part-time, and then they could devote more time to their special hobby or interest or passion, and that will like phenomenally just improve humanity.
100%. But I think that that's on the individual level.
Yes.
I think that the way governments think is they're not thinking that way, because I can point to a few arguments where I can like say that it's the opposite maybe of what you said, right? Like recently, I told you like I'm a nerd on history.
Sure. I love nerds on history.
The Edo period in Japan was like this interesting period where they kind of modernized themselves to be able to keep up with other world economies. And then they slowly started taking small bites out of Manchuria and parts of China and Korea to like expand their empire so that they're no longer wielding sticks and swords while getting shot at.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Right?
Meiji Restoration, I think
yeah.
also.
Yeah. So I think honestly the government in that particular time was like, okay, we're going to have everyone work very hard.
Right.
Because we have ground to cover.
Yes.
And so I think the whole 9 to 5, whatever the original hours were, structure was literally to build it around that. It was
that makes sense. That makes sense. And maybe now that we're quote on top, or I don't know if we're on top
well, it's
anymore.
Changed.
Yeah, it's changed. And I think that I know that with all of my sort of office experience, my limited office experience and 9 to 5 jobs, I always did my job in like 2 to 3 hours, plow through it, and then I'm like, okay, I got to sit in this office now for 5 hours and look busy.
Yeah.
And that, to me, I think is the ultimate productivity killer. And I think that the one positive thing with COVID is that if you're working at home, you could just do your job in 3 hours and then do the stuff that you really want to do. And what's wrong with that? Is there something wrong? Like, do I really have to pretend to look busy for the remaining 5 hours of what it takes? And there are, and some people are probably looking at me like, Aaron, I'm working those full 12 hours. Are you crazy? And then I'm like, God bless you. Yes, that's awesome. Like, if you are working those 12 hours and doing it, being productive. And when I was teaching, I didn't have any downtime. Like, when you're teaching,
it's crazy.
Zero downtime. Every minute was spent lesson planning or grading something and doing something of that effect. So I do feel for people who are working every second. But I think that productivity can't just be measured by time. It's actually just measured by productivity, just how much you're producing.
100%. But, again, I would say that there's multiple degrees of difference. It's like individual productivity. And, does that matter to those that create the organizational structure in the first place?
Right.
Okay, I don't know which is more important than the other, right? Like, if you could change yourself to be more individually productive and innovative at the cost of the country being less productive and innovative, I don't know. That's like an interesting dichotomy that, that would just bring us down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
But the one thing, I've worked in both. Like, before I was helping run companies, it was like 9 to 5 was not my thing. I was hospitality. I was like bartender, server, busboy. Like, first coming here, $300 a week, working all week. Crap stuff, And yeah, I worked all the time. 9 to 5, I think, is a blessing, honestly. The hours aren't that bad. 9 to 5 structure conveniently sits in a very societal saddle. I don't know. It's very easy to fit. Like, all the football games are after. All of your happy hours are after. Your churches is on the weekend. Your meetups are on the weekend.
Yeah.
Things like that.
I will say this. It is, like, again, I've been teaching, and there was a schedule for teaching, whether it was 8 to 4, but here's the catch, though, and here's the rub. It is very static, and it's very predictable because you know your hours, but then there's all that after work that kind of comes, the emails that come after, and it's like, as a teacher, my schedule would end at 3:30 or 4, but I wasn't leaving at those times. So I think that we have these 9 to 5 jobs, but then we're tethered remotely to them. They're still squeezing us even when we're not physically there.
Yes.
And I think France actually has a law. They were maybe the first country that it's illegal for an employer to actually email their employees after work hours.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
If only that were true in
Yeah.
what I do,
Tying it back to the social and personal accountability, I think that whatever mechanism, and I think the final frontier on this is UBI, of, okay, there is this argument that jobs are disappearing, they're becoming automated, we're not going to be able to go to work anymore, and so forth. We don't want to live in a society where it's like, here's your UBI check, your life is inherently worthless. Just sit at home, relax, play video games. Like, there's nothing that you, sir, could possibly do to make this world a better place. We don't want to get to that level.
No.
Because that can lead to forms of, like, social disintegration in terms of people everyone will become a nihilist, everyone will have, like, an existential crisis, everyone will not know what to do with themselves, and people who don't know what to do with themselves tend to engage in things that aren't the best for them. But if we can somehow have that check, but then there's something tethered to it of, like, here's what you ought to be doing. I don't care if it's going to art school for 7 hours a day, or you have to write some book or something. There has to be some kind of purpose attached.
And this is the sinew that we're missing.
Yes.
That connects the two joints. It's like, we can give you UBI, but your personal code and societal code needs to be leveraging what we are giving you as a gift to not put it to waste.
I love that. Yes, that's a good fusion. That is awesome. If you have the personal code in place and you are provided, like, some type of handout, it will not be squandered, because we as citizens now trust each of us. Like, we all trust that we all have a high moral code, that if the government is feeling benevolent and generous and giving us this money, we trust that our neighbor is not going to be squandering it. That's a beautiful place for society to be.
And, it is the most elevated, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't require, like, a 3-letter acronym to make sure you're towing the line. It doesn't require, like, a row of people holding bells yelling shame if you do it wrong. You know what I'm saying? It's like,
yeah.
all it is it's just a gentle understanding. And I think that France may have that in a way.
I like that, yes.
You
They've hit the magical balance. Well, Alex, I think we've kind of made some headway. If any policy advocates are out there, please check this out.
That concludes the 12th episode of the Truth Island podcast. I'm Aaron Azarod.